I watched the county marshal carry the brass nameplate off Vanessa Holloway's office door, while she stood there insisting he had no authority to touch it. He let her finish. Then he unfolded the court order one more time and quietly said, "Ma'am, today I do." Nobody in the parking lot said a word after that. You could almost hear people changing their minds. Just a few minutes earlier, most of them still saw Vanessa as the woman who ran the neighborhood. Now, they were watching deputies seal filing cabinets, carry out computer towers, and change the locks on the building she had walked into every morning for the last 7 years. Funny how quickly confidence disappears when paperwork finally catches up. Vanessa spotted me standing beside my truck and pointed in my direction. "This is what he wanted," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "He destroyed this association over one lake." I looked at her for a second before shaking my head. "No," I said. "One lake was all it took." She looked like she wanted to argue, but for the first time since I had known her, there was nobody left willing to listen. A reporter walked over holding a microphone. "Mr. Whitaker," she asked, "what are you feeling right now?" I surprised myself by laughing a little. "Relieved," I admitted. "Mostly because I can finally stop carrying a folder everywhere I go." She smiled. "That is your first thought." I held up the old leather document case my father bought sometime around 1980. "You would understand if you knew how many miles this thing has traveled over the last 6 weeks." She looked down at the worn leather before asking one more question. "Did you ever imagine it would end like this?" I glanced back toward the association office where another deputy was carefully photographing the entrance after changing the locks. "Honestly," I said, "the first morning, I thought somebody would apologize." She lowered the microphone. "And when did you realize that was not going to happen?" "About 5 minutes after Vanessa came to my driveway." The reporter wrote something in her notebook, thanked me, and moved on. I stood there for another minute watching. Residents quietly collect in small groups. Nobody looked angry anymore. Mostly they looked confused. That made sense. If all you knew was that the homeowners association lost a lawsuit over a private lake, it sounded absurd. It sounded like two stubborn people refusing to compromise. The truth was much simpler than that. The lawsuit was never really about water. It was about ownership. There is a difference between managing a neighborhood and believing you own part of someone else's property. Vanessa never understood that difference until a judge explained it to her, one page at a time. My father used to tell me that land is patient. People are not. I never appreciated that saying when I was younger. Standing in that parking lot, I finally did. The land had not changed. The property line had not moved. The deed had not rewritten itself overnight. The only thing that changed was that someone finally had to answer for pretending those facts did not matter. I climbed into my truck, set my father's old document case on the passenger seat, and rested my hand on it for a moment before starting the engine. That case had spent decades sitting quietly in a closet. Then, almost overnight, it became the most valuable thing I owned. Looking back, I should have known something like this could happen someday. Not because of Vanessa, not because of the homeowners association, because people have a funny habit of believing confidence is the same thing as authority. It is not. I wish I could tell you the whole mess started with a courtroom, or a lawyer, or one dramatic confrontation at an association meeting. It did not. It started on the most ordinary Thursday morning imaginable. I poured myself a cup of coffee, walked the same narrow trail behind my house that I had walked thousands of times before, and headed toward the dock expecting nothing more exciting than feeding the fish before breakfast. I never made it that far. Halfway down the trail, I stopped without really knowing why. Something felt wrong. Then I looked up, and the coffee nearly slipped out of my hand. I stood there for a second, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. The lake looked wrong. It took me another few seconds to understand why. The shoreline had moved. My dock stretched out over mud instead of water, and my fishing boat hung crooked from its lift with nothing beneath it except cracked earth. I actually rubbed my eyes. I wish I could tell you that I immediately knew someone had drained the lake. I did not. My first thought was much simpler. Maybe I had forgotten something. Maybe the county was doing emergency maintenance. Maybe one of the spillways had failed overnight. I pulled out my phone and checked the weather. No drought alerts. No emergency notices. Nothing. I refreshed the page anyway. Same result. That was when I finally admitted to myself that whatever happened, it was not normal. I walked the rest of the way to the dock, careful not to rush. My father had another habit that used to drive me crazy. Whenever something looked wrong, he slowed down instead of speeding up. People miss evidence because they are in too much of a hurry to solve the mystery, he always said. I could almost hear him saying it as I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. Before I touched anything, I started taking photographs. The dock, the shoreline, the stranded boat, the exposed rocks, the muddy banks. I even photographed the water line on the old cedar posts because I knew it showed exactly how much the lake had dropped overnight. Then I noticed several bays trapped in shallow pools that would probably disappear before noon if the sun stayed out. Emily would have hated seeing that. She always knew when the fish were spawning, and every spring she reminded me not to disturb the nests along the western cove. Funny how grief works. You can spend hours focused on a problem, then one small memory catches you completely off guard. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the empty shoreline where she used to sit with a notebook identifying birds by their calls. The sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled me back to the present. A black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly into my driveway and stopped beside the garage. Vanessa Holloway climbed out carrying a leather folder under one arm. She looked cheerful, almost excited. That should have been my first warning. "Morning, Grant," she called with a smile. "Beautiful view now, isn't it?" I looked at her, then back at the lake. "What happened?" I asked. "The board approved a shoreline enhancement project," she said. "People have been asking for better lake views for years. We finally made it happen." I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. "You lowered the lake?" "We lowered the water level," she corrected. "There is a difference." "Who approved that?" She smiled a little wider. "The Homeowners Association board voted unanimously." I nodded once. "That is not what I asked." Her smile hesitated for the first time. "The association manages the community." Still not what I asked. We stood there looking at each other for a few long seconds. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. "Who gave you permission to touch my lake?" The confidence disappeared from her face for just a fraction of a second before returning. "Grant," she said, "the lake benefits everyone." Another answer to a question I had not asked. Looking back, that was the moment I realized she either did not know who owned the lake, or had never cared enough to find out. Years ago, I probably would have argued with her right there in the driveway. Instead, I simply nodded. "Thank you," I said. She frowned. "That is all. For now." She climbed back into her vehicle, looking more confused than angry. I watched her drive away until the dust settled across the road. Then I turned toward the far end of the property one more time. That was when I noticed something I had completely missed. Fresh tire tracks. Wide, deep, and still sharp around the edges. They led straight toward the outlet structure. I stared at them for a long moment before taking another photograph. Heavy equipment had been on my property sometime during the night. Heavy equipment always leaves tracks. The people operating it usually leave something else behind too. I just had not found it yet. I drove past the Homeowners Association office without slowing down. For about 5 seconds, I actually considered pulling in and asking Vanessa one more time what she thought she was doing. Then I laughed to myself and kept driving. If she had already decided the board owned my lake, another conversation was not going to change anything. My father used to say the courthouse settles more arguments than raised voices ever will. That sounded like pretty good advice that morning. Margaret Ellis looked up from the county records counter as soon as I walked through the door. She had worked there longer than I could remember and probably knew every parcel in the county by heart. She smiled, then paused. "Grant," she said, "you look like somebody canceled opening day of fishing season." "Feels worse than that," I admitted. "I need every document connected to Whitaker Lake." She did not ask why. That was one thing I always appreciated about Margaret. She understood that records clerks collected facts, not gossip. 20 minutes later, she wheeled out a cart stacked with deed books, engineering files, survey maps, easement records, and permit folders. "If it exists," she said, patting the top binder, "it should be here." I started with the deed because there was no sense chasing complicated answers before checking the simple ones. Same legal description, same parcel boundaries, same ownership. Nothing had changed since my father transferred the property to me years earlier. I flipped through the survey maps next. Every boundary marker matched the last certified survey. Then I opened the engineering permits for the reservoir. Halfway through the operating file, one paragraph caught my attention immediately. Any significant release of water required written authorization from the recorded property owner and prior approval from the county water authority. I read it once, then again. Funny thing is, I almost kept turning the page. Something told me not to. Instead, I walked back to Margaret's desk carrying the permit. Can you check whether anyone requested approval to lower the reservoir? She turned to her computer and began searching. The room was so quiet I could hear the printer across the hall feeding paper into another machine. After nearly a minute, she frowned. Nothing under Whitaker Lake. Try the homeowners association. She searched again. Same result. She looked back at me over the top of her glasses. Grant, there are no permit requests. No emergency filings. No maintenance authorizations. According to the county, nobody has permission to release that water. I wish I could say I was surprised. The truth is, I was disappointed. Some part of me had hoped there was a misunderstanding buried somewhere inside those records. Instead, the paperwork quietly confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. Somebody had made a very expensive decision without bothering to check whether they had the right to make it. Margaret printed certified copies of every document I requested, stamped each page, and slid the stack across the counter. Before letting go, she rested her hand on the folder. Keep these exactly as they are, she said. Certified records have ended a lot of arguments in this building. My next stop was the County Water Authority. The compliance officer listened carefully while I explained what I had found. He entered the permit number into his system, leaned closer to the monitor, then slowly shook his head. There is nothing here, he said. No authorization. No inspection request. No emergency discharge approval. He turned the screen toward me. The most recent entry was an annual inspection from the previous year. Nothing after that. He picked up his notebook. Mr. Whitaker, if your lake dropped that much overnight without county approval, we need investigators on that property before anything changes. By late afternoon, I was back near the outlet structure, following the same deep tire tracks I had photographed earlier. They ended beside the steel control gate. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed fresh scrape marks around the padlock, bright metal showing through where heavy tools had slipped against it. I crouched down for a closer look, and something bright caught my eye beneath the edge of the concrete platform. It was a small orange plastic identification tag covered in dried mud. I picked it up carefully between two fingers and turned it over. Across the front was the name of a commercial pumping company from the next county. I stood there looking at that little piece of plastic for several seconds. Whoever had cleaned up after draining my lake had done a pretty thorough job. Pretty thorough was not the same as perfect. I slipped the orange tag into a small plastic evidence bag from my truck instead of dropping it into my pocket. Maybe it would turn out to be important. Maybe it would not. Either way, my father always believed you treated every clue the same until the facts sorted themselves out. Evidence does not become valuable because you think it is, he used to say. It becomes valuable because it fits somewhere later. At the time, I never imagined a little piece of orange plastic would become one of those pieces. Before leaving the outlet structure, I walked the area one more time, taking photographs from every angle I could think of. The damaged padlock, the scrape marks, the tire tracks, the exposed shoreline. I almost climbed over the concrete barrier for a closer look inside the control structure. Then I stopped myself. Good thing I did. If county investigators were coming, the last thing I wanted was my own footprints mixed with everyone else's. I called the county compliance officer from the truck. After listening to everything I found, he paused for a second before speaking. Mr. Whitaker, he said, do not touch another thing. We will be there at sunrise. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. The rest of the afternoon felt strangely unproductive. I tried mowing part of the yard, but shut the tractor off after 15 minutes because I kept looking toward the empty shoreline instead of where I was driving. Then I tried reading the newspaper. I could not remember a single headline 5 minutes later. Eventually, I carried a folding chair down near the western cove and sat there watching the sunset. Or at least where the sunset used to reflect across the water. Emily loved that spot. She always insisted the birds arrived there before anywhere else on the lake. I used to tease her that the birds probably had better things to do than keep appointments with us. She would laugh and say, maybe they are just more reliable than people. Looking across all that exposed mud, I realized she would have noticed something else before I ever did. She paid attention to the small changes most people missed. The next morning, county investigators arrived just after 7. 3 trucks. For investigators. Nobody wasted time. One team began photographing the outlet structure while another carefully measured the tire tracks leading from the service road. Everything was documented before anyone touched a single object. Watching them work reminded me of my father building the lake decades earlier. Slow, careful, never assuming. One investigator followed the tire tracks across the exposed lake bed until he suddenly stopped and motioned for the others. He knelt down and brushed away a thin layer of drying mud with a small hand broom. Bright orange appeared beneath the surface. "There it is," he said quietly. They carefully uncovered several feet of a heavy industrial discharge hose running directly toward the outlet structure. It was far larger than anything a homeowner would ever use. The investigator looked back at me. "This lake was not drained with portable equipment," he said. "Someone brought in commercial pumps." Another investigator examined the steel control gate while the others continued documenting the hose. After a minute, he called everyone over. Wedged beneath the control housing was a broken plastic security seal with part of its serial number still visible. He removed it carefully with tweezers and sealed it inside an evidence bag. "Interesting," he said, turning it over beneath the morning light. "County seals are individually numbered." I looked at him. Meaning if this belongs to county inventory, we will know exactly where it came from. Nobody said another word for a moment. They did not have to. Between the industrial hose, the damaged padlock, the tire tracks, and now the broken security seal, the investigation was no longer asking whether someone had intentionally drained my lake. That question had already been answered. The new question was much more interesting. Whoever planned this had gone to considerable effort to make everything look official. If they were willing to do that, what else had they planned before they ever set foot on my property? The county investigators finished their work just before noon, but one of them stayed behind. He was holding the broken plastic security seal in a clear evidence bag, turning it back and forth as if he expected it to tell him something on its own. Finally, he looked at me and said, "Mr. Whitaker, this number is still readable. We will know where it came from by tomorrow." I nodded, but if I am being honest, I was not convinced it would matter. Compared to the industrial hose buried beneath the mud, that little piece of plastic seemed almost insignificant. Looking back, I could not have been more wrong. The next afternoon, Clara Bennett called while I was replacing a loose board on my dock. "Can you come by the county administration building?" she asked. The investigators found something. She did not sound excited. Clara rarely did. She sounded certain, which was usually much more important. When I arrived, one of the investigators was already waiting with several folders spread across the conference table. He placed the evidence bag containing the broken seal in the middle. "Every county security seal has its own serial number," he explained. "They are issued, logged, removed, and retired. Nothing disappears from the system." He opened another folder and pointed to a maintenance log. The seal had originally been assigned to a flood control structure almost 30 miles away. It had been removed during scheduled maintenance nearly a year earlier and placed into surplus inventory. "So how did it end up on my outlet?" I asked. He folded his hands together. "We cannot answer that yet. What we can say is that it did not belong there." Clara looked across the table. "Someone wanted this site to appear official," she said quietly. "Official enough that an ordinary homeowner might assume the county had authorized the work." Nobody disagreed. Before we could say anything else, another investigator walked in carrying a thin file stamped with the logo of Ridge Valley Equipment. "These just arrived," he said. Inside was the rental agreement for 2 industrial pumps, several hundred feet of heavy discharge hose, and overnight delivery. I scanned the first page, then the second. My eyes stopped on the customer information. Silver Ridge Homeowners Association. The payment came directly from the association's operating account. Then I turned to the authorization page. Vanessa Holloway's signature was right where it belonged. Clear. Dated. Impossible to misunderstand. Clara did not smile. She simply tapped the page once with her pen. "Signatures have a habit of outliving explanations," she said. That afternoon, we drove to Ridge Valley Equipment to verify the records. The branch manager welcomed the investigators, unlocked a filing cabinet, and produced the original paperwork without hesitation. Every page matched the certified copies. Clara asked whether they kept delivery notes. "Always," he replied. He retrieved the driver's inspection sheet and handed it to us. There was only one handwritten sentence beneath the checklist. "Customer requested equipment placement beside private lake before sunrise." I read it twice. The driver had no reason to choose those words carefully. He was simply describing another delivery before moving on to his next job. Sometimes the strongest evidence comes from people who never realize they are creating it. As we prepared to leave, the manager suddenly stopped us. "Wait a second," he said. "There is one more thing." He disappeared into the back office and returned carrying a small flash drive. Our security cameras recorded the pickup. We normally overwrite the footage after 90 days, but the county contacted us before that happened. One investigator opened the video on his laptop. Grainy footage filled the screen. The timestamp matched the rental agreement exactly. An association pickup truck backed into the loading area while employees secured the industrial pumps onto a trailer. Then one person stepped into frame, pointing toward the equipment and speaking briefly with the driver before the trailer pulled away. The image was not perfect, but it was clear enough. Vanessa had been there. She was not operating the pumps. She did not need to. She was directing the project before it ever reached my property. Clara closed the laptop and looked at me. "Grant," she said, "we are no longer proving that the lake was drained. We are proving how every decision led to that moment." I thought we had finally uncovered the strongest evidence in the entire case. 2 days later, someone walked into Clara's office carrying an email that should have stopped the whole project before the first pump was ever unloaded. 2 mornings later, Clara called before I had finished breakfast. "Can you come in?" she asked. "Someone just dropped off something you need to see." I almost asked who it was, but stopped myself. By then I had learned that the answer was usually more interesting if I waited. When I walked into her office, a man in a faded blue work shirt was already sitting at the conference table. He stood, introduced himself as Michael Reeves, and shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who spent more time on construction sites than behind a desk. "I own Reeves Civil Engineering," he said. "My company did some survey work around Silver Ridge a while back." The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered the broken survey marker investigators had photographed near the outlet structure. Michael noticed the look on my face and gave a small nod. "That is exactly why I am here." He placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Clara. "I have been following the case. Yesterday, one of my project managers recognized the property from the news coverage. We checked our files." Clara opened the folder without saying a word. The first document was an email from Vanessa, dated nearly 3 weeks before my lake was drained. She wanted Michael's company to inspect the reservoir after the work was completed and certify that everything met engineering standards. Michael leaned back in his chair. "That request bothered me immediately," he said. Clara looked up. "Why?" "Because she was asking for a final inspection before anyone had confirmed they were allowed to begin." He reached for another page. His response was polite, professional, and remarkably clear. "Before proceeding, please verify ownership of the reservoir and obtain all required county approvals." There was nothing technical about it. No complicated engineering language. Just one straightforward recommendation any reasonable person could understand. I read the sentence twice before looking at Michael. "Did anyone follow up?" He smiled, though there was very little humor in it. "Yes." He handed over the next page. Vanessa thanked him for his opinion, but explained that the board had already voted and intended to move forward as planned. No questions. No request for clarification. No indication that anyone had bothered checking the deed or contacting the county. Just confidence. Clara quietly closed the email chain. "This changes the case," she said. Michael shook his head. "No," he replied. "The case was already there. This just explains why it happened." After he left, Clara spread every major document across the conference table. The deed, the operating permit, the rental agreement, the delivery logs, the satellite photographs, the security footage. The engineering emails now fit perfectly into the timeline. Funny thing is, for the first time since this all started, I stopped thinking about evidence as separate pieces. Together they read like chapters in the same story. One document naturally led to the next. One decision created another. Clara tapped the email with her pen. "This is where intent becomes difficult to argue against," she said. Someone told them exactly what they needed to verify. They chose not to. That afternoon, the county invited us to one final technical review. A hydrologist joined the meeting carrying the original engineering drawings my father had kept inside his old leather document case for decades. He studied them quietly for almost an hour before looking up. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "your father built much more than a private fishing lake." He pointed to the spring-fed reservoir system and the controlled discharge structure. This reservoir helps regulate water flowing into protected wetlands downstream. That is why county authorization is required before significant water is released. The environmental compliance officer sitting beside him nodded. Unauthorized releases affect neighboring ecosystems, not just private property. I looked down at those old drawings and smiled to myself. My father used to joke that people thought he saved too much paperwork. Turns out he was not saving paperwork. He was preserving history. Before the meeting ended, Daniel Mercer walked in carrying one more rolled survey map. I almost missed this, he admitted as he spread it across the table. His finger stopped on an easement agreement recorded decades earlier. Then he pointed to a paragraph near the bottom that nobody from the homeowners association seemed to have noticed. "Grant," he said quietly, "I think this may become the most expensive paragraph they never bothered to read." Daniel carefully flattened the old easement agreement across the conference table. The paper was faded around the edges, but every signature, every survey line, and every county stamp remained perfectly clear. My father's signature sat at the bottom exactly where he had placed it decades earlier. Daniel rested one finger halfway down the page. "This," he said, "is the paragraph nobody seems to have read." Clara leaned forward while I adjusted my glasses and looked closer. The language was surprisingly straightforward. If the benefiting party intentionally interfered with the reservoir beyond the rights granted by this easement, the protections provided under the agreement could be suspended until the violation had been fully resolved. I read it once. Then I read it again. Funny thing is, I remembered my father explaining this agreement years ago, but I had completely forgotten that paragraph. So if the association interfered with the reservoir, I began. Daniel nodded before I could finish. They jeopardized the very easement that benefited the subdivision. Clara slowly closed the document and smiled for the first time all morning. It was not the smile of someone celebrating. It was the smile of someone watching the final piece slide into place. "I doubt their attorneys have seen this," she said quietly. Daniel shrugged. "If they have not mentioned it." Driving home that afternoon, I found myself thinking about my father again. He never liked complicated legal language, so whenever he signed anything important, he read every page twice. I used to tease him about it. He always answered the same way. "The sentence you skip is usually the one that matters." Turns out he was right again. The next morning, Clara called before I finished my first cup of coffee. "Come by the office," she said. The county finished reviewing the association's public records. When I arrived, several printed pages were spread across the conference table. At first, they looked like ordinary community announcements. Then Clara pointed to the dates. "Read them in order." The first post appeared the morning after my lake was drained. It proudly announced that the board had completed a shoreline improvement project designed to enhance lake views and increase neighborhood property values. 3 days later, another version appeared. This one quietly shifted responsibility toward outside contractors. A week after that, the explanation changed again. Now the work was described as emergency maintenance performed for the benefit of the community. I looked up from the papers. 3 different explanations. Clara nodded. "Same project. People remember what they post online," I said. She smiled. "The internet remembers even better." Archived copies preserved every version exactly as it originally appeared, complete with timestamps showing when each change had been made. Nobody had erased the first story. They had simply added new ones. Later that afternoon, the county investigators completed their review of the association's financial records. Every payment lined up with evidence we already had. The operating account paid Ridge Valley Equipment. The rental agreement matched the delivery logs. The delivery logs matched the surveillance footage. The surveillance footage matched the satellite photographs. Independent records from different sources, created by people who had never met each other, all described exactly the same sequence of events. Just before the end of the day, Daniel asked me to stop by his office one last time. A large satellite image covered nearly the entire table. "This arrived from the imaging company yesterday," he said. He pointed toward the outlet structure. Even without magnification, 2 industrial pump trailers were clearly visible beside the control gate. He placed the equipment rental agreement next to the image. Same date, same location, same equipment. Then he quietly laid the old easement agreement beside both documents. 3 records created years apart by different organizations for completely different reasons, and somehow every one of them pointed to the exact same conclusion. Daniel rolled the photograph closed and handed me the tube. "Grant," he said, "I think we are finished looking for evidence." I slipped the satellite image into my father's old leather document case and closed the brass latch. For months I believed I had been collecting proof. Standing there, I realized the proof had existed all along. All we really did was uncover it before the judge had the chance to read it for himself. Court began just after 9 on a Monday morning, and for the first time in weeks I found myself with nothing left to organize. Every photograph had been labeled. Every survey had been certified. Every permit, invoice, email, and map sat inside my father's old leather document case exactly where Clara wanted it. I remember resting my hand on the handle for a moment before walking inside. Funny thing is, that case felt heavier when the investigation started than it did that morning. Maybe because uncertainty always weighs more than evidence. Clara was already waiting outside the courtroom carrying 3 neatly tabbed binders. She smiled when she saw me. "Ready?" she asked. I looked at the binders, then at the courtroom doors. "As ready as paperwork can make a man." She laughed softly. "That is more ready than most people ever are." Across the hallway, Vanessa stood with the association's attorneys and several board members. She looked exactly the way she had the morning she came to my driveway, shoulders back, chin high, completely convinced she was on the right side of the argument. Looking back now, I think that was the biggest difference between the two of us. I spent weeks asking whether I had missed something. She spent weeks assuming everyone else had. Once the judge entered, the courtroom settled almost immediately. There were no dramatic opening speeches. No surprise witnesses waiting outside the door. Real property cases rarely work that way. Most of the important decisions are made long before anyone takes the witness stand. The hearing simply gives the evidence a chance to introduce itself. The county called the compliance officer first. He calmly described arriving at my property the morning after the lake was drained, documenting the outlet structure, photographing the damaged padlock, measuring the tire tracks, and recovering the industrial discharge hose buried beneath the mud. Each photograph appeared on the courtroom screen exactly as investigators had taken it. Nobody challenged them because nobody could. Facts do not become less true simply because they are inconvenient. The hydrologist testified next. He unfolded the original engineering drawings my father had preserved for decades and explained how the reservoir operated. He pointed to the spring-fed system, the controlled outlet structure, and the county regulations requiring written authorization before significant water could be released. Then he explained something that seemed to catch everyone's attention. "This reservoir supports protected wetlands downstream," he said. "Unauthorized releases affect more than one property owner." The courtroom grew noticeably quieter after that. Daniel Mercer followed with the county survey maps and enlarged satellite photographs. He placed the aerial image beside the Ridge Valley equipment rental agreement. Same date, same location, same pump trailers beside the outlet structure. Then he added the delivery log, followed by the archived surveillance footage showing the equipment leaving the rental yard. Independent records created by different people, months apart, all describing exactly the same sequence of events. Clara stood only long enough to introduce the final exhibits. The certified deed, the operating permit, the engineering emails advising the homeowners association to verify ownership before proceeding, the easement agreement my father signed decades earlier, the archived community announcements showing how the association's explanation changed over time. She did not give a dramatic speech. She simply let the documents speak for themselves. When it was the defense's turn, Vanessa's attorney argued that the board genuinely believed it was acting in the community's best interest. The judge listened patiently before turning toward Vanessa. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "before approving this project, did anyone verify ownership of the reservoir through county records?" "No." "Did anyone obtain county authorization to release the water?" "No." "Did anyone receive written permission from Mr. Whitaker?" Vanessa looked down at the table before quietly answering. "No." 3 questions. 3 answers. Less than 15 seconds. Months of assumptions quietly collapsed under 3 simple admissions. During a short recess, Clara and I stood in the hallway holding paper cups of coffee that neither of us really wanted. "Nervous?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not anymore." "Why?" she asked. I looked back through the courtroom doors where the 3 binders still rested on counsel table. "Because we stopped trying to win this case weeks ago," I said. Today, the paperwork is just catching up with everyone else. Clara smiled, nodded once, and tossed her empty coffee cup into the trash. That, she said, is exactly what I hoped you would say. A few minutes later, the bailiff called everyone back inside. The judge thanked both sides for their presentations, closed the final binder, and announced that he would issue a written decision after reviewing the complete record. As people slowly gathered their papers, I noticed Vanessa staring at the stack of documents on Clara's table. For the first time since this all began, she was not looking for another argument. She was looking at the evidence that had quietly ended every argument she ever thought she had. The judge released his written decision 11 days later. Clara called before I had even finished pouring my first cup of coffee. She did not say we won. She did not need to. "It is ready," was all she said. I looked at my father's old leather document case sitting by the front door. Funny thing is, I almost left it at home. Then I picked it up anyway. After everything that case had carried through the last 6 weeks, it somehow felt wrong walking into the courthouse without it. By the time we arrived, several reporters were already gathered. Outside, residents from Silver Ridge stood quietly across the sidewalk, speaking in low voices. Nobody looked excited anymore. Curiosity had replaced gossip. Inside the courtroom, everything felt strangely familiar. Same wooden benches. Same flags behind the judge's bench. Same courtroom where, less than 2 weeks earlier, months of evidence had finally been laid out in order. The judge entered carrying a thick written opinion and immediately began explaining how he reached his decision. He did not rush. He walked through every major exhibit one by one. The recorded deed established ownership beyond dispute. The certified survey confirmed the property boundaries had never changed. The operating permit required written authorization before significant water could be released. The engineering plans demonstrated how the reservoir supported protected wetlands downstream. The rental agreement connected the industrial pumps to the homeowners association. The payment records confirmed who authorized the expense. The delivery logs matched the satellite photographs. The surveillance footage placed Vanessa at the equipment yard before the pumps were delivered. The engineering emails proved the association had been warned to verify ownership before moving forward. Finally, the archive community announcements showed how the explanation changed each time new evidence appeared. I glanced toward Vanessa only once. She was no longer sitting with the same confidence she carried on the first day of trial. She was simply listening. When the judge finally closed the binder, he looked across the courtroom before speaking. "The evidence presented in this matter is remarkably consistent," he said. "Independent records created by unrelated parties all establish the same sequence of events." He paused for just a moment. "This court finds that Whitaker Lake has always been privately owned by Mr. Grant Whitaker. The Homeowners Association possessed neither ownership nor legal authority to alter the reservoir." There it was. The very sentence Vanessa could have discovered herself with one visit to the county records office. The judge continued reading. Judgment was entered in my favor. $14 million in damages were awarded for property loss, environmental restoration, remediation costs, and related expenses established during trial. The court further authorized immediate enforcement against qualifying homeowners association assets. Nobody reacted immediately. The silence somehow carried more weight than applause ever could. Vanessa slowly closed the folder in front of her. Months earlier, she had stood in my driveway telling me the board had voted unanimously. Now, 12 jurists worth of paperwork, engineers, surveyors, investigators, and one judge had quietly reminded her of something a vote could never change. Ownership. Outside the courthouse, county marshals immediately began carrying out the enforcement order. By the time I reached the association office later that afternoon, deputies were documenting equipment, securing financial records, and changing the locks. The same brass nameplate I had watched being removed weeks earlier now rested inside an evidence box waiting to be inventoried. An older resident walked over holding a folded copy of the court's decision. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "can I ask you one question?" "Of course." He looked down at the opinion before speaking. "If they had checked the deed before draining the lake, would any of this have happened?" I smiled because I already knew the answer. "No," I said. 5 minutes at the county courthouse would have saved them years of trouble." He nodded slowly. "That may be the most expensive assumption I have ever seen." "Mine too." Spring returned a few months later. The restoration crews finished their work, Native grasses slowly reclaimed the shoreline, and the reservoir quietly filled again as the underground springs resumed doing what they had done for generations. One morning, I carried a cup of coffee down the same trail behind my house. This time I heard the ducks before I saw the water. A bass broke the surface near the dock. Wind moved gently through the cattails Emily loved so much. I sat on the old wooden bench overlooking the western cove and opened my father's leather document case one last time. The deed was still there. The surveys were still there. The permits were still there. Exactly where he left them. I smiled because, after everything that had happened, I finally understood what he had been protecting all those years. It was never just paper. It was proof. Proof that confidence is not ownership. Proof that authority does not appear because someone votes for it. And proof that the truth has an odd way of waiting patiently. Until the day someone finally decides to read the first page, instead of assuming they already know how the story ends.